You're listening to a podcast from the BBC World Service. This is Hardtalk with me, Sean Lay. Thanks for downloading this edition of the programme and I hope you enjoy it. Hello and welcome to Hardtalk on the BBC World Service with me, Sean Lay. My guest today is Frances O'Grady. She represents more than 6 million British workers, members of the country's trade unions. Yet union members are becoming less and less typical of the country's workers. Just over half of those with government jobs are in unions. In the private sector, the figure is less than 15%. As Labour, the political party the unions created a century ago, begins a leadership election and debates its own future, maybe it's the unions who should question theirs. Frances O'Grady, General Secretary of the TUC, welcome to Hardtalk. The financial crisis hit workers across Europe amazingly hard. We saw unemployment rise, we've seen austerity cuts in response, pushing down living standards for many. Why haven't more of those affected by the consequences of that crisis looked to the unions to be their champion?
Well, I think many do, and let's not forget, I think the trade union movement is the only organisation in Britain where people say only 6 million strong. I mean, 6 million members for a democratic organisation is pretty big, and we still make a huge difference to people's working lives.
Half of what it was, though, 30 years ago?
Absolutely, and we've got our work cut out to bring in new generations of workers, but I think I need to be honest and say it's a lot tougher when you've got workers on 0 hours, perhaps bogus self-employment contracts or working short hours jobs. The labour market looks very different to that of 50 years ago.
And yet some of the problems faced in terms of getting a collective voice, particularly for those people, for arguing for better conditions, are not so different. And one would have thought that the unions would be exactly the place they would have looked.
And that's exactly what we intend to do. I'm very keen in particular to make a major new initiative around organising young workers. Lots of young people caught in low-paid jobs, often 0 hours contracts, working as baristas or shop workers or cinema workers. And we do have many in membership, but we need to build that up much more.
It's not just a problem, as I was alluding, confined to Britain. It's a problem across Europe. Oscar Molina of the Institute for Labour Studies at the Autonomous University of Barcelona wrote earlier this year that trade unions as political organisations have been explicitly rejected by large parts of the civil society movements during the financial crisis. It's a pity, kind of devastating critique, isn't it, of the voice that the unions have had and the perception of their potential influence, that the people, when they most need them, look elsewhere.
Well, luckily inaccurate too, because
Really?
I think if you look at the campaigns that have been run for fairness at work, critiquing some of those austerity policies that have held back recovery, giving us the slowest recovery on record, I think trade unions are seen as very much at the heart of that broader civic society campaign. But we're also, let's recognise, this has been something that's been happening for 30 years or more, that's coincided with those Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan years when neoliberalism was the dominant way of thinking about the economy, and where trade unions were systematically marginalised and subjected to some pretty tough legislation, tougher than many other countries in the world.
Well, you clearly think it's going to get tougher. One of the changes that the British government is now proposing is that there should be a minimum turnout requirement for unions when they ballot for strike action, 50% turnout requirement. What's wrong with that?
Well, in fact, of course, the government's proposing more than that. It's this double threshold, the 50% plus in essential public services, which we still need to hear an absolute definition for, but
well, they're talking about, I think, transport, fire service,
health, education,
yeah,
that they would have to meet a 40% yes vote. Now, this is unprecedented. It has the bizarre consequences of making an abstention as powerful as a no vote, and also is a hurdle that no politician needs to meet. So police commissioners, for example, we had a 15% turnout.
Hang on a minute. I mean, that's not really a realistic comparison, is it? When you're talking about an election for a job like police commissioner or MP, you'll have a multiple number of candidates, maybe half a dozen, maybe more, maybe fewer. This is a straight binary choice. It's a yes or no.
In which
case, really, should it be so difficult to get to that turnout
Perhaps
threshold.
I'll give you a straight comparison, and of course that's the forthcoming EU referendum. Do you really think that David Cameron, who wants Britain to stay in the EU, is going to place a 40% yes threshold on his own turnout for that, of all those entitled to vote? I doubt it very much, and I think people will see this as one rule for the politicians and another for the organisations of ordinary working people.
Might they not, though, also echo the view of government ministers who've said, look, it is basically unfair that you can have a situation at the moment where a strike can be called and held when perhaps only 40%, less than 40% of the members have taken part. I'll give you a very specific example. A couple of years ago, 82% of teachers who took part in a strike ballot by one of the British teaching unions voted yes, but actually only 27% of that union's eligible members had voted in the ballot. I mean, is that really a mandate on which a union can possibly close down schools and disrupt children's education? Because that's what happened.
Well, that's precisely why we've been arguing for a number of years now, and in fact worked closely with Vince Cable and the CBI.
He was the former business secretary in the last government. Yeah.
On an alternative proposition for safe and secure electronic voting in the workplace or on a smartphone, safe and secure.
You think that would boost turnout?
We have evidence it will boost turnout.
Fine, so that would solve your problem, would it, on the ballots?
Exactly, but the government, I'm afraid, won't agree currently, and instead is pushing for thresholds that are totally artificial.
So you say to me, if they did agree to that, you would be prepared to accept this turnout requirement?
I don't accept that unions should be subjected...
So that's a smokescreen, really, isn't it? To
well,
talk
no,
about
absolutely it isn't. On the contrary, any true Democrat who wants to see more participation in ballots, not just in union life, by the way, but more generally, should be looking at 21st century methods. And we want to drag this government into the 21st century and really give people a chance to participate, because we know that people tend to see mail that comes through the post ends up on the mantel shelf or in with the recycling. So why not give us the modern methods that we've been asking for? That would deal with the problem.
Sajid Javid, who's the current business secretary and who will be putting through this legislation the government is proposing, has said what people are fed up of is strike action that hasn't been properly supported by members of the relevant union. We've seen strike action take place where perhaps only 10 or 15% of the members of that profession actually voted for it, and that's not right. And a lot of people watching and listening to you today will agree with him.
Well, I think Sajid has yet to come up with an answer as to why this government won't take up our proposal of electronic balloting, which you would have thought true Democrats would be keen to see in place.
But just on his point that there's a sense of unfairness, particularly those people affected by industrial action, they might accept the principle that people should have the right to go on strike, and he isn't challenging that at all. But they might say, why should this amount of disruption be caused when a lot of union members can't even be bothered to take part in the ballot, when the union can't convince a lot of its own members that it's even important enough to take part in the vote, never mind to go on strike? What sort of mandate is that? Well,
in the absence of electronic ballots, of course, what really counts is who comes out on the day. But the point is that this
it doesn't always work like that, does it, these days? It's mostly by post these ballots take place.
It is by post, yes. And that's part of the
problem.
It can be over
a number of days.
You'll have seen, for example, with the bus workers, that what really mattered was who came out on strike on the day, and we saw very strong turnouts. And what's more, actually, the public supported them. Do you know what? I think the public has a real sense of fair play. It understands that nobody takes strike action lightly. Nobody wants to see strike action. But unless you have that right to strike, then all of the cards are in the employer's hands. And one of the problems I think most people agree that we've been talking about is this imbalance of power. It's one of the reasons why we've got 5 million people earning less than the living wage. It's one of the reasons why the government's introducing this draconian legislation, because it doesn't want working people to get in the way of the cuts to services and in-work benefits that people care about.
Well, one of the ways that you wield influence as a movement, as the Labour movement, is through the political voice that many of the trades unions have. Those that are, in particular, those that are affiliated to the Labour Party, currently in opposition, a lot of them pay into a political fund. This is the other change the government's looking at. In future, union members will need to opt in to contribute to their union's political fund rather than, as at present, choose to opt out if they don't want to. Have you made any assessment of what the impact of that change will be? on your member unions?
Well, it wasn't very clear in the Conservative Party manifesto, and we haven't seen a published bill yet, so I think we all have to see the detail on these proposals.
What worries you about it?
What worries me, again, is this dual standard. I think most people don't worry too much about shop workers, factory workers, nurses and health workers giving a few pence every week into a political fund voluntarily.
Of course, if they know they're even doing it. I mean, Unlocked Democracy did a survey of the 15 unions affiliated to Labour, and it said only one of them, Unison, mentioned the Labour Party connection. And only 2 of them mentioned the existence of a political fund at all, Usdaw, the Shop Workers Union, and the Musicians Union. The others don't mention it. You have to kind of dig around to find out.
Well, when we've run our campaigns, I think you'll see that most people do appreciate the work that's been done, the campaigning that's been done for decent jobs and homes.
And you think they know they're paying for it and they have the option not to pay for it.
Exactly. But I think what people are worried about is some of the links of hedge funds, private equity partners, very rich individuals and corporations who fund many political parties in Britain. People worry about that because it's about the influence of a very small number of individuals. You'll remember that the Lobbying Act was supposed to tackle just that, but somehow ended up catching charities, trade unions and campaign organisations like Hope Not Hate, the anti-fascist group. So I think people still feel that the business hasn't been done in terms of tackling big money in politics, and many of us would like to see more controls over that.
I mean, you are big money in Labour Party terms, aren't you? I think about 58% of its donations.
In terms of individuals, this is a few pence every week.
Collectively, the union movement.
This is the cleanest money in politics. Okay. It's transparent and it's reported. I'm afraid some of that big money people feel worried about.
What about that relationship with Labour? Because I mean, it's kind of historic. It's well established. I think Ernie Bevan, who was one of the big figures of the union movement in the first half of the 20th century, and indeed subsequently of the Labour Party, said the Labour Party grew out of the bowels of the trade union movement. It's an interesting image, but I think we know what he was trying to get at. I wonder, though, whether it still serves its purpose, because you could argue that maybe you'd be listened to a bit more by the Conservative government if you weren't seen as partisan.
Well, there are different views on that. 15 out of our 50-plus unions are affiliated to Labour. That means an awful lot aren't.
But most of them, the big unions
ones
are. Yeah.
And that shared history is important, but it's also about shared values. We want to have the right to a political point of view. Unions need to be able to campaign. We wouldn't have the Equal Pay Act, the NHS, free education for school children if it wasn't for union campaigning.
But
so,
of course, that's important. I mean, one wonders if that relationship is still as healthy as it might be. In fact, Lord Mandelson, former Labour Cabinet Minister, has described it as incredibly unhealthy. And some in the Labour Party might think, given it was the unions who effectively gave them Ed Miliband, the rather hapless leader that Labour has just seen resign after losing the last election, who had a very unhappy 5 years as party leader, that maybe that relationship isn't serving the interests of the Labour Party or its supporters either.
Well, I think it was Jack Jones, the union leader, who once said, murder maybe, divorce never. So for sure, you've got organisations which may disagree sometimes. That's the nature of democratic debate. But if it's united on those basic values of fairness and looking after working people, looking after the vulnerable, then that's the shared values that bind people together. But I would say this about your comment on the loss of the last election. Actually, the issue of the leader was way down people's priorities. The real issues, as we know, were number one, economic competence and trust, and number two, the way in which nationalism was played as a card by the Conservative Party in terms of fears of the SNP.
On trust, though, it was very personally identified between the contrast between Ed Miliband, the Labour leader, and his shadow chancellor, and David Cameron, the Conservative leader, and his chancellor. I mean, it was very personalised, and arguably, if you'd had a more effective leader, people would have had more trust in the party's ability to handle the economy.
Well, the TUC carried out polling just after the election to find out why people voted as they did. And I think one of the big issues for Labour that Labour needs to address is that many people felt that it failed to counter that Tory mantra of Labour's mess by actually pointing out the reason we were in trouble was because of the bankers' mess, and that maybe an admission that we all needed to be tougher on the banks and regulation of big business earlier would have helped in terms of building that trust.
What about an admission from you that the trade unions did not cover themselves in glory by ensuring that Ed Miliband became leader of the Labour Party.
Well, listen, this was a democratic vote. And
well, not according to Harriet Harman, the party's acting leader. She says last time the unions communicated directly with many of their members, only mentioning one candidate. There'll be none of that this time. The winner of this election is not going to be the choice of the unions.
Well, Ed Miliband changed the rules and the unions supported that along with the rest of the party.
You accept that those kinds of practices were not acceptable?
Well, what I'm saying is that clearly the rules have changed.
But do you think it was right for the unions to be basically saying to their members, vote for this guy?
I don't have the patronising view of trade union membership that suggests.
Or that Harriet Harman has, then.
Well, no, I didn't say that.
Well, no, but she's saying the unions directly communicated with their members, only mentioning one candidate. There'll be none of that this time. She's saying that the union membership was wrongly treated by its leadership.
I don't think that Harriet Harman is saying that Ed Miliband shouldn't have been elected, because he clearly was.
He's questioning how the unions used their influence.
Yes, but the new rules will ensure that every member gets the chance to vote. And clearly union leaders will express a view, or they may not express a view. But if they do, that doesn't mean that everybody follows what their elected leader says.
Okay.
We've all got minds and hearts
Indeed,
of our own.
and I'm sure you have as well. So what's your view?
Well, I think, like everybody else, I think we're all waiting to hear what the candidates have to say.
What sort of leader do you
want?
But
what I'm interested in is somebody who clearly will promote the issues that matter to ordinary working people. And the TUC, along with the unions, have been campaigning for decent jobs, for fair pay, to get some house building programmes going and to protect essential services like the NHS. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think it would be a real mistake to throw the baby out with bathwater, and I think Ed Miliband had some important insights about extreme inequality and how that damages everybody, and how we have to tackle the root causes of inequality, not just the symptoms.
You know all these people, though, and you know them quite well, because they would regularly have been in contact with the Trade Union Congress as well as with the individual unions. What's your assessment of the, I think as we are speaking, we've now had the formal four names, Jeremy Corbyn, a veteran left-winger, Andy Burnham, former health secretary, Liz Kendall, one of the new generation of Labour spokespersons, and Yvette Cooper, also another former cabinet minister. Well, which of those appeals?
As you know, the TUC is not affiliated to the Labour Party, and we're here to work with whoever's elected in the same way that we work with whoever is in government. So you've no personal view, no individual view on who of those four would best represent the interests of your member organisations? The best way I can represent the TUC and working people is by arguing that they need to take up some of those key issues that really matter to people that we talk to in real workplaces around 5 million people earning less than the living wage, the need for fair pay, the need for improving people's lives in a real way.
Let's leave aside then whether or not the Labour Party still serves those people. Do the trades unions?
Absolutely. There is no other independent democratic organisation of working people representing everybody from footballers to factory workers to office workers and midwives who have just applied to join the TUC. So we represent people from all walks of life, but I'm not complacent about that. As I said, I really want to reach out to young people in particular and make us relevant to them, and that's tough in a world when they're often at the front line, the rough end of the labour market.
Just on the 2 points really. The first is the practical one, which is we've already alluded to earlier in the programme. That's the decline in membership. I think it's now 25%, the lowest it's been in 20 years. Quite a long way down, as we said, from the late 1970s. Steady, but the workforce has actually grown slightly, and trades union membership has not grown with it. You'd accept that?
Absolutely.
So how can you say that you are best placed, I think you said in earlier this year at the launch of the Trade Union Statistical Bulletin, best placed to speak on behalf of working people to combat growing inequality and help ordinary families when you represent a relatively declining proportion?
Well, our job is to champion all working people, and there is no other organisation that is independent and democratic that can claim to speak on behalf of working people. Of course we need to grow again, and that's a big priority for the TUC, but let's not underestimate the strengths that we have. Most of the blue chip companies recognise unions, those classic companies like BMW or BT or the NHS, BAE.
They do recognise
They
unions.
recognise and work in
partnership
partnership
But they recognise
with
unions that don't represent the worst off and don't represent many of those in the private sector. I mean, you mentioned private companies like BMW. You represent about 14% of people working in the private sector. That's an abysmally low share, isn't it?
We want to grow it, but let's not forget either that our collectively bargained agreements don't just cover that 1/3 of the workforce who are directly covered. We often set the pace for paying conditions across whole industries. We set the rate for the job, and that's important, I think.
One thing that worries a lot of your members, and it picked up in the survey you mentioned actually earlier in the programme, the one you did just after the election, is the effect immigrants are having on their earnings and their job prospects. Are you perhaps out of step with how many of those people feel? I think you said yourself that looking at the survey results, they were challenging on the issues of migration.
Well, clearly the TUC has always had a position that we need a managed approach to migration. We've always understood that, and we understand too that migrants make an incredibly important contribution to many areas of our economy, and overall there are gains, but that in some industries, unfortunately, some employers have used migrant workers to try and undercut paying conditions and indeed jobs.
So there is a link between the two things.
In some industries,
right,
you can see that. But it's not unique to migration, by the way. Those same employers have in the past used young people, women, or internal migrants from one part of the country to the other.
So on this question, I suppose many of your members...
So the answer is very clear. The answer isn't to blame the migrant worker for that. The answer is to get tougher on those employers who are trying to exploit them, because if they're trying to exploit migrant workers, they're probably trying to exploit those who are born here
in that
too.
survey you conducted back in the spring, the second biggest concern raised about immigration among union members, about 30% of them said immigrants working for less, putting pressure on wages. They see a link there. They might on that basis wonder why you're not campaigning with David Cameron, the Prime Minister, in his attempt to renegotiate Britain's relationship on Europe, where he wants to reduce the number of migrants coming to the UK from within the EU for jobs here. They would have thought that you as their representative would be standing side by side with the Prime Minister.
What we're trying to do is ask David Cameron to come clean on what he's really trying to renegotiate with
But would you like to see
at
that,
the moment,
a reduction in the numbers of EU migrants who come here to work?
I think the key problem here is whether or not we hand an open check to those employers looking to exploit migrant workers, or whether we get tough on them.
Or protect your own workers here in Britain?
Well, the best protection, as we know, is to ensure that there's equal pay and equal treatment. And the problem is that there's a very strong suspicion here that the government is actually trying to water down workers' rights, whether that's agency workers' rights, or whether that's on working time, or whether it's any new rights for the future. Now, if that's what David Cameron is really trying to renegotiate in Europe, then that is not going to encourage ordinary working people to vote to stay in. We know there are important benefits for jobs and investment of membership of the EU, but if this is about worsening workers' rights, then he's not going to win people's votes.
Frances Grady, General Secretary of the Trades Union Congress, thanks very much for being on Hard Talk.
Thank you.
This edition of Hard Talk was presented by me, Sean Lay. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.